Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University, and welcome to the video Models of Instructional Design. This is part of the instruction for EDU553, a graduate class in Principles of Instructional Design at Misericordia University. In this video, let's examine the Dick and Carey's model of instructional design. And then let's compare it with the ADDIE model that we've already considered. And to wrap up, let's refer to our work in comparing and contrasting different instructional design models. Let's begin our survey of instructional design models by considering the comprehensive Dick and Carey model. The Dick and Carey model is research-based and it's most comprehensive, and it consists of 9 steps. It begins with the front-end analysis, the setting of instructional goals, and the instructional analysis or the task analysis. From there, the designer can determine and set entry behaviors and learner characteristics, and then set about to identify performance objectives. After the objectives are written, the designer can then create a criterion referenced test or test items. Then set about to determine what instructional strategy will be utilized and create the instruction and the instructional materials. Then designers need to perform formative evaluation and then summative evaluation after making the tweaks that are necessary as a result of the formative evaluation. Let's take a look at this model in tabular or flowchart form. Here, in this flowchart, you can get a better overall picture of the Dick and Carey model. We begin with step number 1, and we'll take a better look at these steps in a few moments. But just as an overview, you begin by identifying instructional goals. And step 2 and 3, you'll notice, can happen at the same time. Conduct the instructional analysis, also known as task analysis. Identify entry behaviors and characteristics. That's understanding the learners who are about to undergo this instruction when it's prepared. And then from here, we move into, from both of these steps, into writing the performance objectives. After you write the performance objectives, Dick and Carey say, develop your test items. Then we'll develop instructional strategy, and we'll develop and select or select materials as needed to support the instruction. And then we design and conduct formative evaluation. Notice step 9 is back here, and notice that step 9 is constantly revisited. Revise instruction as needed. So at any point in this process, we have to go back and revise the instructional piece. We conduct the formative evaluation on the instructional module, and we revise as needed, and then we develop what is hopefully our final product, but then we do a summative evaluation on it too, and once again, we go back to revise as needed, and notice that the revision also includes going back to the very beginning and to make sure that we know the learners and that we understand what the task is. So let's take a better look at each of these pieces. Step 1 in the Dick and Carey model is to identify instructional goals. Now, in order to do this, they recommend doing a needs analysis. Where is the gap in knowledge for the learners? In other words, where are the learners now and where do they need to be? And let's fill in that gap with an instructional intervention. What kind of instruction might address this problem? After we identify the instructional goals, Dick and Carey say we can do 2 things simultaneously. The first of which is an instructional analysis, also known as task analysis or procedural analysis. In other words, let's examine the task to be taught, and let's examine in great detail the steps and the skills that are needed to complete this task. and what kind of mental processes, what kind of decisions are needed to complete this task when the learners do perform it. At the same time, Dick and Carey suggest that we can learn more about our learners. What are their entry behaviors? And also, what are their characteristics so we can best tailor instruction? So we ask questions like, what enabling skills do the learners already have within their capabilities? So we're talking about their intellectual skills, their level, their various abilities, and that includes their verbal comprehension level. Are we going to give instruction through technology? What's their technology competence in that case? What's their level of mastery of prerequisite skills? And let's look at their personality. What kind of traits do they have? To what do they relate? What motivates them? What interests them? What's going to drive them and motivate them in this training or educational activity? What prerequisites might we have to review with the learners so that they can scaffold onto there and have these new skills? What skills can we assume that the students already have, and we can, so to speak, get away with not covering and not teaching to them? And out of all of this, we want to learn what are the instructional strategies that might be effective to work with these learners, considering their characteristics and also the entry behaviors that we're going to expect that they already have. Having performed those front-end tasks, Dick and Carey say now we can go ahead and write performance objectives. In other words, let's translate the needs analysis. Let's translate the goal or goals of training into specific and detailed operationalized objectives. What will they learn in this training module? What will be the conditions under which instruction is delivered? How can we test the acquisition of these objectives and the completion of them? And how can we help the learners prepare for assessment? Once the designer has identified the performance objectives, now it's time, according to Dick and Carey, step number 5, it's time to write criterion-referenced test items. First, let's look at the purposes. Certainly, as teachers, we know that these test items are used to determine if the learner has actually acquired the material, the content, the skill being taught. So we do that in 2 places, at the end of instruction as a summative, and we also do that as a formative activity during instruction, but we do this formatively by embedding practice items. And it's a self-test. Now, in some cases, we may force or provide an opportunity for the learner to review content if they have not passed it. If we're engaging in the type of training that is leading to a certification of some sort, we may have to force the learner to go back if he or she has not passed. I realize that a designer using this formal model of instructional design may also use the results of these test items to help evaluate the effectiveness of the instructional materials, which includes the instructional product. Remember, Dick and Carey say the formative and summative evaluation of the instruction itself before we even get to share the instruction with students. Depending on the nature of the training or this educational product that we're going to develop as a result of the instructional design process, we may need to use the results of these test items to document progress for different stakeholders, like parents or the state or the school board. Now, if it's within a company, we may have to document progress for supervisors or administrators or regulatory agencies. The thing that interests me here, and the thing that kind of really fascinated me and blew my mind when I first was exposed to this model down at Lehigh University, was that the model suggests basically that the test can be written before the instruction is ever designed. As a teacher, how many times have you done that? How many times have you said, okay, I'm going to set out, here's the objectives, here's what students are going to learn. How about I go ahead and write the test now, before you ever even contemplated how to design the instruction? So to me, that's really interesting, but it shows the robustness of this model. If you're following these procedural steps in this model, really at this point, and that is after you identify those performance objectives for the students, now it is time that you can write the test items. Not that you can't have flexibility to change them a little bit or word them differently, but that will keep you honest, so to speak, and make sure that there's a one-to-one correlation. Here's the objective, here's a test item in which you can observe and document that the learner has acquired that information. But the timing of the writing of the test items is fascinating here. Let's pause for one moment and consider the criterion referenced test. If we look at a norm referenced test, we're talking about a test that is going to yield an estimate of the position of the person being tested within a predefined population. If we're looking at criterion referenced, by contrast, we're looking to see very directly, here's an objective, did the student master that? Yes or no? So they're graded against a standard of performance. So the designer has to establish a cut score and say, well, this is the line. This is where we determine if the person has mastered the material that's content or they have not. So for the purpose of instructional design, we normally use criterion reference tests. According to Dick and Carey, now that we know what we are going to teach and how we are going to test it, the acquisition of those objectives and goals, now it's time to focus on instruction. Now, it's only listed as one block in their model, but as you can figure, it's a very large block. How do we meet those objectives? How are we going to teach and convey that information? How are we going to practice that with the learners to ensure their mastery of that content? That's all contained in this step. We have to design the best, most appropriate lesson considering the learners and who they are and their interests and their motivation and their pre-existing knowledge. And we would ideally like to tailor or gear that lesson design for that particular group of learners. So are we going to use analogies, metaphors, examples? Which ones are going to really speak to those learners based on their characteristics? What kind of methods of teaching should we employ based on what we know about the learners? So it's all based on that learner analysis. Compared to a face-to-face traditional classroom where we may throw in some jokes and we may add other motivational factors, when we're teaching based on instructional design, and maybe we're going to, and maybe even likely, offer the training product through some technological means, we need to make sure that everything's tightly focused and all the instruction is closely linked to the objectives without some extra material in there. Part of our instructional strategy also includes the choice of delivery system. Are we going to use more direct instruction, more lecture? Are we going to do more hands-on in some way? Are we going to provide for that within the training product? Are we going to make this an individual-paced activity for the learners? And what are the best methods of delivery for these learners? Is it video? And also considering the content. Is it audio? Is text-based? Does that make sense for more visual for these students? Can we do simulation or project-based learning? What works for this content and this particular group of learners? Then we start developing our instruction. As we develop instruction, we also consider the development as needed of instructional materials. Are there existing materials that we can tap into? But yet maybe these existing materials are generic and they're generally good, but they're not really geared to be appropriate for this set of learners. So maybe we'll also have to allow time to develop new materials. In the last two steps of the model, we talk about the evaluation of the product. So at this point, again, we're talking about the product development and not looking at learners and testing them at this point. So right now, we've prepared a prototype of an instructional module. So let's start, Dick and Carey suggest, by looking at determining the technical issues and the flow of the lesson, like is the product working and how's it just working in general. And we can do that with just a small group of people, maybe 1 to 3, and maybe they'll be doing it one-on-one. Then they suggest, let's start looking at measuring the instructional effectiveness. Of course, that's the goal of conducting this instruction in the first place. Then we move to that piece, and maybe we can have a small group go through the instructional module and test it to see how are they acquiring the knowledge and the skills that they have been exposed to through the instructional module. And then we can look at doing a field trial. Let's take it in a real setting, so to speak, and let's further focus in on the instructional effectiveness. Of course, every step of the way, we are tweaking and redoing and redesigning our materials as needed, which could involve us going right back to our first steps if we find that the instructional product is not as effective as it could be or should be. Step number 9 is the summative evaluation, and at this point we're looking at how effective are these instructional materials, our instructional module, over time. And you could normally do this after a few cycles of instruction. So really after step 8, you're ready to take it on the road, so to speak, and use it with real learners. But now we need to look at the long-term effectiveness of this. A couple of thoughts. Sometimes the learners change, so we may have to revise instruction based on that. Sometimes the needs in that setting, whether it's a school or a corporate setting, may change. For example, technologies may advance. The way that things are done in that particular place have changed. So the summative evaluation involves long-term to make sure and to ensure that our instructional product is very effective for the long haul. Having viewed the Dick and Carey very comprehensive model, last week in class we took a brief look at the ADDIE model. Let's now take a few moments and just compare the steps of the ADDIE model and think about how that relates to the Dick and Carey model. The first letter in ADDIE refers to analysis, and here you can see all of those levels of analysis kind of placed in one step. We see the needs assessment, we see the content analysis or the task analysis, analyzing the learners and analyzing their environment. The design phase, as suggested by ADDIE, is really it's a very big step because we're talking about everything incorporated into this step. The writing of the objectives, the creating the practice that we're going to use during instruction, the assessment. But again, notice the assessment is written very early in the process. And then we will organize lesson units, and also at the same time we have to determine what's the best delivery method. So notice Dick and Carey have kind of stretched it out a little more and made it a little more specific in terms of the systematic way of developing all of this. ADDIE says you do all of this in step number 2, but notice the same steps are here. In the third step of ADDIE, development, notice that ADDIE is really focused on how you produce your instructional product. So here under development, incorporates producing any media resources, instructor materials, and they're thinking here, the designers of the ADDIE model, that maybe you're going to have multiple instructors in different locations. So we need materials so that everyone is speaking from the same page, so to speak. The participant materials have to be created. And then they've also allowed in here to rehearse the presentation. ADDIE's implementation phase deals with scheduling with either real learners or some test learners, establish some communications, and then do the presentation or the delivery of the instruction. Similar to as found in the Dick and Carey model, the last phase in ADDIE is evaluation, and they're suggesting content evaluation by a subject matter expert. Ensure that the content is substantial and is appropriate and effective. Evaluate the prototype. So at this point, they're assuming it's not perfected, as Dick and Carey said in their next to last step. Let's test it. Let's evaluate it. And then finally, let's also evaluate the learners. And let's see how they're doing. Let's ensure that they are acquiring the objectives and satisfying the goal of training, and that it's happening very effectively. So notice, even within the ADDIE model, that evaluation is an integral part of the process. It's not just like, let's give a test at the end type of thing, but let's do two things on two levels. Let's keep evaluating the product at every step of the design process and the development process, and let's test those learners during instruction and after instruction. So evaluation of the product and the learners is critical. An activity and an assignment that arose out of our last class together involved all of us comparing a model or several models of instructional design, and there are many models that exist, and comparing them to the ADDIE model. And hopefully you have found by now that the ADDIE model contains all the fundamental building blocks that are built upon in all of these different instructional design models. And each model focuses just a little differently on and focuses more strongly on different parts of the design process, depending on the purpose of that model where it should be used. Now at this point, you can examine and compare the models that you looked at and compare it with Dick and Carey. While ADDIE provides those fundamental building blocks, Dick and Carey provide a much more robust, thorough, and full model. To summarize, at this point, having considered the ADDIE model and having considered the opposite end, the Dick and Carey thorough, robust model, you can see that there's a big difference between the planning and the preparation that go into the traditional face-to-face teaching that many of us do, compared to developing instructional products through the process of instructional design. Before developing instruction, we perform a really involved front-end analysis. We analyze the learners, we analyze the training needs, and we analyze the task in a highly detailed fashion, and then develop our objectives, our performance objectives, what the students will do at the end of training. And then we also at this time are prepared to develop our criterion referenced test items. So a lot of preparation goes into this. Having considered in this video various instructional design models, looking ahead for our next steps, next week, let's begin looking at that front-end analysis, needs assessment, audience analysis, task analysis. What's involved in those steps, and how do we actually perform them in a systematic process of instructional design? But first, in a separate video this week, let's consider how people learn. Hope you enjoyed this class. See you in our next video.